Support for this and all the free content of Addressing Gettysburg is made possible by our patrons over at patreon.com/addressinggettysburg.
I'll turn it on for you.
Good. All right, yeah, I'm ready.
Good afternoon, everybody. It's good to see so many of you. The sun's coming out. It's a good day to be in Gettysburg, and we're certainly happy to have you here. Many of you no doubt know of our winter lecture speaker today, Steve Phan, and it is my distinct privilege to be able to introduce him to you if you don't. Steve Phan is a park ranger and historian at the Civil War defenses of Washington. And prior to his arrival at that site, he worked as a volunteer intern and park ranger at a variety of different sites, including the Richmond National Battlefield, the Hopewell Culture National Historical Park, Stones River, and Rock Creek. Steve's a military history scholar of the Civil War era. He focuses on the military occupation, operational command, and fortifications during the American Civil War. He's the author of articles about Asians and Pacific Islanders in the Civil War and the defenses of Washington, D.C. for numerous publications, and he was most recently nominated for the National Park Service Freeman Tilden Award for Excellence in Interpretation, which if you're in the National Park Service, it's a big deal. He holds a master's degree in American history from Middle Tennessee State University, and it is my distinct pleasure to welcome him here to Gettysburg today. So join me in welcoming Mr. Steve Phan.
Thank you. Can everyone hear me clearly? Yes. All right, great. Well, before I begin, I want to express my deep gratitude to my friend and mentor, Chris Quinn, for the invitation to present at the Winter Lecture Series. Gettysburg National Military Park is where my National Park Service journey began back in 2012, so this always feels like a homecoming. So today's lecture, entitled The Defenses of Washington During the Gettysburg Campaign, will provide a unique view of the three-day battle from the hectic confines of the federal capital. This program will demonstrate how far-reaching and impactful the Confederate invasion of Pennsylvania was on the Union war effort. It is scarcely necessary to dwell upon the necessity in the Civil War through which our country has just passed of holding and defending Washington. And that's Brigadier General John G. Barnard, Chief Engineer of the Defenses of Washington. You're going to hear his name throughout this program. He is instrumental in the construction, design, and elements of the Defenses of Washington, and critical in the way he believes the Army of the Potomac should work hand in hand with the defenses of Washington. And you'll see that in this program. So by June 1863, Washington, D.C. was one of the most heavily fortified cities in the world. In fact, the capital forts were reaching their zenith in design, construction, and armament. By year's end, over 60 forts, 80 plus batteries, 37 miles of earthworks, and 30 miles of military roads encircled Washington. The earthworks bristled with heavy caliber firepower. Over 700 cannons and mortars guarded every approach to the city. The foundation of the Capitol defense was laid in May of 1861. Over the next 3 years, the circle forts grew to cover and guard every approach to Washington in northern Virginia, along the Maryland border, and southeast along the Anacostia River. There's General Barnard, the Chief Engineer. That's a map of Washington, D.C. in 1865 with all the different forts. You're going to see three different sections here. The Arlington line, which ranges all the way down to Alexandria. They call this the Northern Defenses, guarding D.C. from Maryland. They call this the Eastern Branch line. They called it the Eastern Branch, not the Anacostia River that we call it today. So this is the Eastern Branch line. The defenses evolved in direct response to matters in the field, specifically the military campaigns around Washington, most critical being in Northern Virginia and Maryland campaigns of August and September 1862. The defenses, seemingly impregnable on paper, were deficient in scale, design, and firepower. So you're going to see some images of the Capitol forts here. This is Fort Slemmer in northeast Washington, D.C. I believe this is the best image of the defenses of Washington, to see the scale, the scope, and the design. All made out of earth and wood. Fort Slemmer, on the property of Catholic University now of America. And if you follow our Facebook page, I will be posting an article. We did a site visit out there, assisting the history faculty staff of Catholic University, and we did find some remnant earthworks out there. Fort Totten, not the metro station, the actual fort. This is one of our sites in Rock Creek Park. Fort C.F. Smith in Arlington, Virginia. In Chain Bridge, for my friend that's in the crowd right now. Even a blockhouse in Virginia. So all the different components you see of what I call or describe as Fortress Washington. Not one fort, but an elaborate system of fortification, earthworks, and armament. So 1863 witnessed the next major evolution of the defenses of Washington. And this dramatic expansion began at the very top of the War Department. October 12th, 1862, the Adjutant General will prepare an order for a commission as suggested within, signed by Edwin M. Stanton, Secretary of War. I want you to listen to this closely. A commission consisting of Brevet Brigadier General Joseph G. Totten, Chief Engineer, United States Army, Brigadier General Montgomery C. Meigs, Quartermaster General, United States Army, formerly of the United States Engineer, Brigadier General William F. Berry, Chief of Artillery, Brigadier General John G. Barnard, Chief Engineer, Defenses of Washington, Brigadier General George W. Cullum, United States Engineers, Chief of Staff to the General-in-Chief, was appointed by the Secretary of War October 25th, 1862, and this is in quotes, to examine and report upon a plan of the present forts and sufficiently of the present system of the defenses of the city. So this is in response to the Maryland campaign, when the federal engineers in the War Department realized that the Confederate Army could march directly south from Maryland and hit the northern defenses of the city. So you have all the chiefs of the United States Army, and they will spend the next 2 months riding around Washington, D.C., taking reports, making suggestions, and this is what they will give to the Secretary of War. Actually, in his after-action report written in 1871, this is what General Barnard says, and I want you to listen to this closely. There are, therefore, in the whole system as it now exists, this is December of 1862, 53 forts and 22 batteries. The total armament actually mounted in the different works at the date of this report is 643 guns and 75 mortars. The total infantry garrisons required for their defense computed at 2 men per yard of the front perimeter and 1 man per yard of rear perimeter is about 25,000 men. The total number of artillerymen required is about 9,000 men. It is seldom necessary to keep the infantry supports attached to the works, and this is probably one of the most important aspects of this report. The artillerymen whose training requires much time, having learned the disposition of the armament and computed the distance of the ground over which attacks may be looked for, and the ranges and service of their guns, should not be changed. They should remain permanently in the forts. Tell General Grant that in 1864. The 25,000 infantry should be encamped in such positions as may be most convenient to enable them, in case of alarm, to garrison the several works, and a force of 3,000 cavalry should be available for outpost duty to give notice of an approach of an enemy. So we're talking close to 35 to 40,000 men should be in the garrisons of Washington, D.C. at all times, according to the recommendations. And this is what happens, according to General Barnard. The various operations recommended by the commission, sanctioned by the Secretary of War, were prosecuted with great vigor during the early part of the year 1863. The new works recommended were entirely completed during that year and ready indeed to render efficient service by the time the season of active field operations commenced. So what is this going to look like, my friends? Well, probably one of the most famous images of the defenses of Washington. This is Fort Stevens. This is where the main battle will take place in July 11th and 12th, 1864. Fort Stevens is dramatically expanded in 1863 from a 200-yard perimeter to almost 400 yards and nearly 20 artillery pieces. One example right there. For my friend in the front row here, this is Fort Lincoln in northeast Washington, D.C., near Bladensburg. And what is so important about this image is right there. The addition of massive artillery, most notably being 100-pound Parrott rifles. So, and I'll talk about that in a second. So this is what this is going to look like. So there was erection of additional earthworks, including Fort Bayard, Fort Kearny, Fort Foote, Battery Rogers, and connecting earthworks and batteries near Chain Bridge. Enlargement of current works, including Fort Stevens, Fort Slocum, Fort Reno, and Fort Bunker Hill. 4 of those forts will see action during the Battle of Fort Stevens in 1864. And as I talked about, the emplacement of large caliber artillery pieces, including the 100-pound Parrott rifles, had a length of 138 inches, 11 feet, weighed 9,700 pounds, could fire a 100-pound projectile. The charge of powder was 10 pounds. The maximum range was 7,800 yards. So we're talking about 4.4 miles. The flight time was about 32 seconds. And it took a crew about 17 men to operate that gun. And these guns will come into action in 1864. The mounting of Battery Kemble with the 2 100-pound Parrott rifles. These will be overseeing Chain Bridge in northwest Washington here. And there is Fort Totten, the addition of, you can see the number right there, gun number 13. This is the 100-pound Parrott rifle. At Fort Totten, in the northeast section of the fort, this fort, as I said, managed by the National Park Service, this gun will see action in support of Fort Stevens during the battle in 1864. In total, the Union Army mounted 14 100-pound Parrott rifles in Washington, D.C. by the end of the war. 14. And I want one. So if my friend Quisquin, I see him up top, my goal is to have this recreated at Fort Totten. Okay? Talk to me afterward. Okay. Ooh. What about this? The addition of, these are the largest guns in the federal arsenal in Washington, D.C. This is Battery Rogers, right outside of Alexandria. Right across the Potomac River on the Maryland side will be Fort Foote, and they're protecting Washington from a naval attack from the Confederate Navy, notably ironclad gunships. The 2 guns you see there, 15-inch Rodman gun or Columbiad, the largest gun that they have in Washington, D.C., and a 200-pound Parrott rifle. Massive, massive guns. This gun itself, the barrel weighs 49,000 pounds. Meaning you should come out to Fort Foote with me. There's 2 original guns still in place at Fort Foote managed by the Park Service. So one of the main focuses of this program will be the relationship between the defenses of Washington and the Army of Potomac. And how do I describe it? It's complicated. So what will this look like, friends? Well, we're going to go to 1863. February 1863 brought much needed reform and reorganization of the defenses of Washington, which was once directly attached to the Army of Potomac. According to historian Frank J. Welcher, this is what he says. The functions of the Army of the Potomac and those troops in the military district of the defenses of Washington, which was a district of the Army of the Potomac, had become so different that the 2 organizations had little in common. As a matter of fact, At the time, the commander of the defenses of Washington was acting almost entirely under the orders of the General-in-Chief of the Army or of the War Department, and not the commander of the Army of the Potomac. Therefore, to provide better administration of the territory around Washington, on February 2nd, 1863, the Department of Washington was constituted. That same order that created the Department of Washington also designated the troops included within its limits as the 22nd Corps, 22nd Army Corps, Department of Washington. The Department of Washington was re-established under the command of Major General Samuel Heintzelman, split away from the Department of Potomac when Joseph Hooker took over the department from Ambrose Burnside. It consisted of the area north of the Potomac River in Maryland, from Piscataway Creek to Annapolis Junction, to the mouth of the Monocacy River, and south by Goose Creek and the Bull Run Mountains to the mouth of the Occoquan River. A massive territory department. And this is what this will look like. The scale of the defenses of Washington and the range. So, an incredible image that was just posted online recently on one of the Civil War sites. This is the Arlington House, the Lee Mansion there. General Heintzelman is standing right there, and to his shoulder is Matthew Brady. An incredible image. So when we talk about the 22nd Army Corps, it's important to understand the Corps was not a mobile force for field duty, but it instead served as a permanent garrison for the capital defenses, and also a force ready to reinforce the Union Army if necessary. So you got two distinct military organizations here, two separate, but it's complicated because General Barnard and his engineers saw this situation quite differently. He saw a symbiotic relationship where the forts and the garrisons were a shield working hand in glove with the maneuverable army in the field. The army is the sword. One could not complete their mission without the support of the other. General Barnard made this point very clear in June 1863 as the Confederate Army of Northern Virginia launched their offensive north. There's another image of General Heintzelman, the first commander of the 3rd Army Corps. He spent a lot of time in Washington when he lost his command of field duty, and so he took a lot of images with his buddy, Matthew Brady. And then again, General Barnard. So, the defenses of Washington played a significant role in the Gettysburg Campaign. The capital, is often viewed on the periphery, the symbolic backdrop shielded by the Army of the Potomac as it pursued the Confederate Army into Maryland and Pennsylvania. At the beginning of June, the Department of Washington 22nd Corps reported 34,831 men present for duty. This number was reduced in the coming weeks as infantry, cavalry, and artillery units were detached to reinforce the Army of the Potomac. The forthcoming campaign revealed once again the dysfunction of the Federal High Command, notably the War Department and the armies in the field. And we're facing towards Gettysburg. So at the center of the drama was the deteriorating relationship between General-in-Chief Henry Halleck and Major General Joseph Hooker, commanding the Army of the Potomac. The last month of Fighting Joe's command witnessed this struggle and ultimate defeat in reinforcing his army without interference for the coming battle. As Lee advanced north into Maryland, Hooker pursued cautiously. The commander was forced to not only follow and engage the Confederate Army, but also shield Washington and Baltimore. By the 3rd week of June, Hooker's command was enlarged to include the Army of the Potomac and the troops in 2 other military departments, the Middle Department in Baltimore and the Department of Washington. In doing so, the War Department greatly enhanced his responsibilities, but with a caveat. Hooker did not possess the direct command of the forces without the approval from Washington, nominally Henry Halleck. This tug of war, notably Hooker's attempt to circumvent Halleck's orders by appealing directly to the President and Secretary of War Stanton, came to a head in late June. cage match between Halleck on the left and we know Fighting Joe. So I call this section Forts to the Front. So what's this going to look like? Prior to Hooker's resignation, the War Department responded to his request for reinforcements by detaching several units from the defenses of Washington to the Army. And reinforcements included the 2nd Vermont Brigade, commanded by Brigadier General George J. Stannard. In his after-action report, General Stannard stated that, this is in quotes, the 2nd Vermont Brigade marched from the line of the defenses of Washington upon the Occoquan on June 25th, under orders to report to Major General Reynolds, commanding the 1st Army Corps. The brigade joined that corps at that place on the evening of July 1st, after an exhausting march of 7 days' duration. The distance marched averaged about 18 miles per day. The men marched well, with no straggling. Rain fell on every day of the 7, and considering the condition of the roads, the distance traveled from the mouth of the Occoquan to Gettysburg could not have been accomplished in less time. There's General Stannard right there. Also joining the Army of the Potomac was General Reynolds' former command, the famed Pennsylvania Reserves Division that had served in the defenses of Washington and Alexandria, Virginia, for rest and refit following the Gettysburg Campaign. The 1st and 3rd Brigades, commanded by Brigadier General Samuel Sprague Carroll, were detached and reassigned to the 5th Army Corps, arriving to Gettysburg in time to see heavy action on July 2nd. The 2nd Brigade remained in Alexandria. General Carroll there. Another command who fought just down the road from the Visitor Center was directed to the Army. The so-called Harper's Ferry Cowards, under the command of Brigadier General Alexander Hayes, who had served in the defenses of Washington since their surrender at Harper's Ferry in September 1862. Hayes was elevated to command of the 3rd Division of the 2nd Corps. His brigade saw heavy action on July 3rd, redeeming their blemished honor along the stone wall of Cemetery Ridge. There's the Fighting Halleck right there. What about heavy firepower? That was sent as well. 2 artillery batteries were sent from the defenses and reassigned to the Army of Potomac's Artillery Reserve. Horsepower. The 3rd Cavalry Division under Major General Julius H. Stahl was broken up. The regiments were transferred and reorganized into a new 3rd Division under General Judson Kilpatrick. There is Stahl right there. But wait, there's more. So there's an appearance from Ron Popeil in the program. What about the Middle Department, based in Baltimore, Maryland? 2 infantry regiments were sent to reinforce the Middle Department headquartered in Baltimore under the command of Major General Robert Schenck. The defense of Washington, D.C. and Baltimore were absolutely critical. There's Major General Schenck right there. But wait, there's more. There's also the Department of the Susquehanna. In response to the Confederate invasion, the War Department called for 100,000 militia to repel the invasion of the North. In Pennsylvania, Secretary of War Stanton ordered the creation of the departments of Susquehanna and Monongahela. Thank you. The former commanded by Major General Darius Couch. Artillery batteries were sent to the Department of Susquehanna to bolster the defenses of the Commonwealth. You got Coach right there. The Department of the Monongahela consisted of Western Pennsylvania under the command of Major General William T.H. Brooks, a combat veteran of the Army of the Potomac. So you see the dispersal of troops from Washington, D.C. to all these different departments in response to the Confederate invasion of the North. So the dispersal of troops, cavalry, and artillery from the capital defenses demonstrated the range and effectiveness of the Army of Northern Virginia's offensive. The Federal War Department, mostly in a reactive state, cobbled together troops and material to defend the home front. So this is one of the most important aspects, I think, of this program, is this relationship between the Army and the Capitol defenses. So as I said, there's command and confusion. It's complicated. So each side will see their roles a little bit differently. The Army of the Potomac commanders saw Washington as an unnecessary obligation, complicating their operations in the field. They also saw the defenses as a vast resource of men, fresh reinforcements to replenish the ranks, and attempted to strip the forts whenever possible. Army brass in Washington, notably Generals Barnard and Heintzelman, saw the Army of the Potomac as the Capitol's shield, working in unison with the forts to protect the city. The mixed messages disseminating from the top, mostly General Halleck, caused confusion and frustration with the Army and the people in Washington. In the midst of the campaign, General Barnard details the desired relationship between the Army and the defenses in a confidential message to Heintzelman, and listen to the date, June 25th, 1863. I'm going to read portions of this report, which you see on the PowerPoint there, and it says, confidential, headquarters, Chief Engineer of Defenses, Washington, June 25th, 1863. Major General Samuel P. Heintzelman, Commanding Department of Washington. General, our conversation this morning prompts the following remarks and suggestion. It was never supposed that the forts would protect Washington, would protect Washington. Aided by darkness or fog, bodies of cavalry may pass between them, or columns of infantry may, if aided by artillery and infantry attacks upon the works themselves, the latter being fully deployed, otherwise, contrive to pass through. The works themselves are not deemed secure without full garrisons, the requisite infantry supports to man the parapets. I understand that not only are there no troops left to man the rifle pits and to support the artillerymen of the forts, but that not even the number of artillerymen is up to the standard, which is about 9,000. The safety of Washington is therefore dependent upon Hooker's army, and that army must constantly keep itself between the enemy and the very considerable body of the enemy and the city. But Hooker ought to, and doubtless will, maneuver his army without such a trammel, and if he gives battle, whether in Virginia, Maryland, or Pennsylvania, he ought to give it with his whole force. A considerable body of cavalry might, under such circumstances, dash in and destroy Washington. In the absence of troops, we should have an organization of the citizens of Washington. And I'm going to jump down towards the end of the report. He says, the enemy is now within striking distance, and should the fluctuations of the campaign carry our own army from between him and the city, he might be able by rapid march of all or part of his army to attempt a coup de main. The quartermaster's department has a large number of employees who, I am told, have been organized. The citizens and transient persons in Washington should be able to organize a force of 12 to 15,000 more. Altogether, we might make up 15 to 20,000 men, which number, armed and drilled to use of the musket or field piece, organized into companies and battalions, and their alarm posts assigned, would enable us to resist an attack in considerable force. So General Heintzelman is suggesting that Washington take all necessary steps to defend the Capitol. So General Heintzelman affirmed Barnard's view and suggestions, especially the arming of government employees for emergency service, in several messages to General Halleck. And this is what he says. Should the casualties of the service compel General Hooker's army to uncover Washington, we must be in a condition to meet any force that an enterprising enemy might detach to make an attack upon this city. I am aware of the difficulty of replacing troops withdrawn from the defenses, but I submit these views in hopes that something can be done to make use of the population of the district in defending their own property as well as that of the government. Okay? Defense of the Capitol. So troops will be sent to the front. So ironically, the removal of troops from the Department of Washington was not enough for Mr. F.J. Hooker. He desired more men and went directly to the top of the federal government to secure them, and this will lead to his demise. You see General Hooker right there, and to his left will be Daniel Butterfield, his chief of staff. And I want you to listen to this. It's really interesting what he does. He's going to send Daniel Butterfield to Washington, D.C. to appeal for more troops. And this is his orders. Major General Butterfield, chief of staff. General, you will proceed without delay to Washington, get the returns, character, and position of the troops in General Heitzeman's command, deliver the letter entrusted to you to Major General Halleck, make the representations concerning the troops to His Excellency, the President and the General-in-Chief, which I have charged you with. Proceed to Baltimore, get the returns of the troops in General Schenck's department, organize a column of 15,000 troops to move without delay to Frederick. So Hooker's letter requested the authority to not only be given command of all the troops in the military district that included Harper's Ferry, Washington, and Baltimore, but it also, most importantly, was just to have direct control of the troops in that area that he could bring with him to the Army of the Potomac. This is important. If Halleck declined, he was to go directly to Lincoln or Stanton. Butterfield received these instructions on June 24th. He dutifully reported the results of his mission to Hooker 3 days later. And this is what he writes to the Hooker on June 27th. And he writes, General, I visited Washington and Baltimore on the 25th and the 26th. On my arrival there, I was unable to find General Heintzelman or any of his staff at his headquarters. There, excuse me, let me finish that part. Therefore, I could get no report from him of the forces in and about the defenses of Washington. I then called immediately upon Major General Halleck, General-in-Chief, handed him my letter of instructions to read, and stated to him the purposes of my visit. General Halleck replied that no troops could be spared from the defenses of Washington. I stated to him that General Hooker desired me to say that he deemed it proper to give the enemy battle in front of Washington or Baltimore rather than near those places, as the most proper place to defend them, in accordance to what Barnard wants. Receiving no assurance of any troops from General Halleck, in accordance with my letter of your instructions, I called upon His Excellency, the President, and laid my letter of instructions before him, repeating your verbal orders, your verbal instructions. The President sent for Major General Halleck, before whom my instructions were again laid, with the inquiry from the President if he could furnish any troops. General Halleck replied that he considered it unsafe to take any more troops from the defenses of Washington, that there were several millions of public property in the shape of the quartermasters and commissary supplies and ordnance stores, that the secessionists might rise and burn this property at any time unless it was strongly guarded. He considered the state of the public feeling such as to justify him in anticipating such results in case any portion of troops were withdrawn. So the answer is pretty simple. We're not going to send you any more troops from Washington. He will actually get returns back, and the number actually is pretty much the same that it was in the beginning of June. 36,000 men were in Washington, D.C. He will then proceed to Baltimore. As he said, I then proceeded immediately to Baltimore and laid my orders before Major General Schenck, commanding the Middle Department. He evinced the most earnest desire to comply entirely with your wishes as expressed in my letter. In reply to your verbal instructions, he stated that he agreed entirely with your views, that it was better to defend Washington or Baltimore in front of either place rather than the very gates. After consultation and examination, I took all the available troops, consisting of General Lockwood's brigade, about 2,500 men, put them on the road, leaving a small garrison in the city of Baltimore. Those troops will be attached to the 12th Army Corps. So this will be Joe Hooker's last battle with the Army of the Potomac. As I said, he desired not only reinforcement, but also direct control over the men and his expanding department. In D.C., the commanders pleaded for reinforcements to garrison the fort. So you're sending troops out, and they're wanting troops to come in. Troops were sent from all over the North, including New York City and Baltimore. And this deteriorating relationship will come to a head on June 27th. And this is when Hooker's resignations will be sent to the War Department. And this is what it writes. I think a lot of you have read this. This is dated June 27th at 1 p.m. It's received by 3 p.m. by General Halleck, and this is what it says. General-in-Chief, my original instructions required me to cover Harpers Ferry and Washington. I have now imposed upon me, in addition, an enemy in my front of more than my number. I beg to be understood respectfully but firmly that I am unable to comply with this condition with the means at my disposal, and earnestly request that I may be at once relieved from the position I occupy. Halleck's response was quite terse. Lincoln accepted his resignation and assigned Major General George Meade to command of the Army of the Potomac that evening. What about the defenses of Washington during the Battle of Gettysburg? Well, as the two armies met on July 1st, the mood in Washington remained tense. General Heintzelman described the capital in great excitement to letters home to his family. He tried to remain active while strengthening the defenses. According to his biographer, he became so fearful of an attack on Washington that he organized all the employees of the quartermaster and commissary departments and requested permission to recruit citizens from the capital and Alexandria into home guard units. When scouts reported that Jeb Stuart and 7,000 cavalrymen were nearing Washington, Heintzelman began planning for an all-out defense of the capital that included recruiting more black troops and arming the city's numerous convalescents. Should Stuart attack, Halleck even urged him to place mounted batteries of artillery on the streets of Washington. That was vetoed by Secretary of War Stanton. So what forces were left in Washington to defend the capital? We've got elements of the heavy artillery units that are manning the large guns. And then, as we just discussed here, all this government clerks that were armed and sent to the front lines to man the forts and earthworks. So you got an image of the quartermaster department. This is the horseshoe shop going against Confederate veterans. Don't forget about the blacksmith shop from the quartermaster department. I think a lot of people have seen this image of this Army hospital. It stood at the intersection of 6th Street Southwest and B Street. It's now Independence Avenue. Today, the National Air and Space Museum stands in its place. There were elements of the United States Colored Troops. The first United States Colored Troops were organized in Washington, D.C. Specifically, they were trained on Theodore Roosevelt Island. They called it Mason's Island during the Civil War. This is the image of the 4th USCT at Fort Lincoln in 1865. And if all else fails, you turn to these gentlemen right here. It's the U.S. Treasury Department Battalion. And you can see, obviously, the unfinished Capitol, the Washington Monument in the background. It's an incredible image. So Heintzelman assured the Secretary of War that he had taken all the precautions for the defense of the city and the public property, which the limited means at my disposal will permit. Despite his alarm, which irked both Halleck and Stanton, Heintzelman believed that the Army of the Potomac would gain a major victory in the coming days, but was fearful that Lee's army would escape to fight again. And that's what he writes: "All I fear is that Lee will be able to make good his retreat to the Potomac." He was right about that. His fear was realized. In the days that followed, Heintzelman ordered cavalry units into the field, hoping to cut off Lee's retreat, but found mostly Confederate horsemen and some wagon trains. For now, the capital was secure. Federal engineers, soldiers, and civilian workers, including formerly enslaved African Americans, spent the remainder of 1863 adding and expanding the forts, mounting guns, and building structures, especially along the Washington and Maryland border. The expanded works were ready when the Confederate Army arrived in July of 1864. A Confederate officer described the Capitol offenses in great detail. I believe this is the best description of the Civil War defenses of Washington from a Confederate soldier. And this is what the officer writes: "When we reached the right of the enemy's fortifications, the men were almost completely exhausted and not in a condition to make an attack. Skirmishers were thrown out and moved up to the vicinity of the fortifications. These we found to be very strong and constructed very scientifically. They consist of a circle of enclosed forts connected by breastworks with ditches, palisades, and abattis in front, and every approach swept by a crossfire of artillery, including some heavy guns. That officer was none other than Lieutenant General Jubal A. Early, writing to General Robert E. Lee in days after the Battle of Fort Stevens in July of 1864. So, the Army of the Potomac's epic fight at Gettysburg was celebrated in Washington. A Federal soldier described the scene, writing, "Captured battle flags were strewn and paraded to the deafening cheers and the booming of artillery. Wounded soldiers arrived in the capital for weeks and were treated at the Army hospital spread out Washington, including this gentleman who you may recognize. Major General Daniel E. Seckles, commanding the 3rd Army Corps, originally Heintzelman's. This is an image of them in Washington, D.C. Heintzelman will be relieved of command of the Department of Washington in November of 1863. So, for a few of the men who gave the last full measure of devotion, their sacrifice was honored in the defenses of Washington. And I want you to listen to this report. Headquarters Chief Engineer of Defenses, Washington, September 4th, 1863, Colonel J.C. Kelton, Assistant Adjutant General. Sir, I respectfully recommend that the following works and forts forming part of the defenses of Washington may be called after these officers whose names are set opposite, who have died or been killed in the service of the United States. First, Redoubt A near Fort Lyon, to be called Fort Weed, after Stephen H. Weed, Captain 5th Artillery, Brigadier General Volunteers, killed July 2nd, 1863 at Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. There are no remnants of the fort located near in Alexandria, Virginia, or near it. Redoubt B near Fort Lyon, to be called Fort Farnsworth, after Brigadier General E.J. Farnsworth, killed July 3rd, 1863 at Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. There are no remnants of that fort as well. Redoubt C near Fort Lyon, to be called Fort O'Rourke, after Patrick H. O'Rourke, First Lieutenant of Engineers, U.S. Army, Colonel of Volunteers, killed July 2nd, 1863 at Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. There are no remnants of that fort. But there is a Fort Farnsworth Road. Redoubt D, near Fort Lyon, to be called Fort Willard, after George L. Willard, Major 19th Infantry, Colonel of Volunteers, killed July 2nd, 1863 at Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. Was that July 3rd? No, 2nd, wasn't it? Okay. There's O'Rourke. And so this is the main fort, and here are the readouts. They're just artillery positions that are protecting the approaches to Alexandria. And this is what it looks like today. There's Colonel Willard, and there are remnants of Fort Willard today, managed by the city of Alexandria. The earthworks are there. I suggest going to see it. It's right in the neighborhood. You can read that right there. And last, and certainly not least, Fort Blanker, south side of the Potomac, to be called Fort Reynolds, after Major General John F. Reynolds, killed July 1st, 1863 at Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. So I was talking to Chris Gwynn about this before the program. There were remnants of Fort Reynolds still around in the 1950s. And historians from the state of Virginia wanted to preserve the site. If anyone's ever been in Northern Virginia, near DC, that's not going to make you a lot of money. So Unfortunately, the remnants of it were plowed over, and there's a neighborhood and a park there, so it's called Fort Reynolds Park. This is kind of an older image of the sign because someone wrote a B there and tried to make that look like Burt Reynolds. So pretty sure that was John Heiser. So, and there is Fort Reynolds Park in Arlington, Virginia. Okay, and I will conclude the program with this final slide. And this is a project that I've been working on for about 2 years now, and it's called Faces of the Forts. And so the Civil War Defenses of Washington is undertaking a project to document the story of federal soldiers, civilians, formerly enslaved African Americans, and anyone who were connected to the defenses of Washington during the American Civil War. During the Civil War, tens of thousands of soldiers, civilians, African Americans found employment and refuge in Washington, D.C. Their individual stories will be documented and shared with the public. And this project is managed by me. We'll be sharing stories and accounts, mostly primary resources of people that served in DC during the Civil War, okay? And this project really started from you. I had a lot of people from the public come up to me after my programs were talking and said, hey, I had an ancestor or a great-great-grandfather that served in this fort. I've got some of his documentation, I have his image, do you want to do something with that? Okay, so the plan is to create a story map on our website where you can click on a map of Washington, D.C. It'll be all the forts and camps around Washington. You can click on a particular site and an image and bio will pop up of these people. Okay, if you're willing to be a part of this program, this project, please let me know. I must preface this by saying if you share your image with us, it will become part of public domain. Okay, but what we really want to do is to make this we want to connect people across the country and world with this. We want to put a face on the defenses of Washington and learn more about these people. To give you an idea of what these people look like. An unidentified soldier at Fort Marcy. 107th United States Colored Troops in Northern Virginia. Rhode Island troops at a fort in Arlington. Michigan troops at a fort in Northern Virginia. Heavy artillery troops at a fort in Northern Virginia, Arlington line. 31st Pennsylvania. This was near Fort Bunker Hill. We can literally put this on the map. Families. I think a lot of us have seen this image. Families, children. What's the name of the dog there? You know, we want to know all this. And one of my favorite images of the Civil War from Washington, D.C. This is Camp Brightwood, a little bit south of Fort Stevens in northwest Washington, D.C. Very early in 1862. There's an estimated 40 to 50,000 formerly enslaved African Americans that came into federal lines. Many found employment with the Union Army. And look at these young men and boys posing with the Union soldiers here. Wouldn't it be incredible if we can identify some of these people? Some of these soldiers here, actually, we know who these officers were. They were later killed in 1864. So this is the project that we're launching beginning in February of this year. I'm still going through the paperwork or the red tape. So if you wanted to be a part of that or learn more about that, just please send me an email there. You can also find us on Facebook and on our website. I thank everyone for being here. Thank you so much. Are there any questions? Can I take questions, Chris? Sir.
Are there any maps that explain in any sort of detail which sorts of guns would be mounted at which positions? Because it looks like the single batteries, a swivel gun would have been a great placement there.
There are. We were very fortunate. We had, through my friend Brandy, he actually worked for the National Archives in Maryland. We had one of our interns. She visited the archives in Maryland and College Park, and she digitized about 800 of the original engineering blueprints. Original, they're like this big. And she was able to digitize those for us, and they list the armament of all the guns there. And also, I think another source that you could use as well, sir, is Mr. Lincoln's forts. It's the standard, right? I call it the Fort Bible. Each fort is listed on there, and it has the armament and the units that serve there as well.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, you're welcome, sir. Sir.
Other than the issue of retaining enough men in the defenses, was there any other reason why the 2nd Brigade of the Reserves were retained?
Of the Pennsylvania Reserves?
Yeah.
Yeah, Halleck didn't want to send the entire division out. He wanted to have some troops in Alexandria just in case. So really interesting. A lot of people believe that the defenses of Washington really began after the Battle of First Manassas, and that's not the case. It began in late May of 1861, when the War Department and the Army realized that Virginia was going to secede from the Union. That evening, the Union Army crossed the Potomac River into Arlington, and the next day they marched down to Alexandria. And according to General Irvin McDowell, he's like, the next morning we started building earthworks. So they built 6 forts within the span of about a month or two before the Army marched off to Manassas to fight the first battle in July of 1861. So there were issues in Alexandria. There was a military governor there, so they wanted to have experienced troops in the city just in case. But that's a great question.
Steve,
Yes.
wasn't there a regiment whose enlistment was about to expire, and so to get them to re-enlist, they gave them all the Medal of Honor, which was later revoked?
I believe that's so. I'm trying to remember if this is specifically attached to this campaign, but I think you're right with that. I don't know the details on that, but that sounds around that time, yes. Yes, sir.
This may call for speculation, but did Hooker think that Butterfield would succeed with Halleck and even Lincoln, or was it just, I need to cover myself that I did everything I could?
Well, that's interesting. I think he was unsure, but he had like a backup plan, right? Which he specifically writes in his letter of instructions. If Halleck says no, which I think he's expecting, go directly to Stanton and Lincoln then, because they'll hear me out, right? And I was talking to a historian, Noah Andre Trudeau, who's a historian of the battle, and he said, Hooker hedged his bets that, he's going to basically throw off this bluff, right? If you don't give me direct command of the troops and send me the reinforcements I want, I'm going to resign. And he didn't think the Army would actually take his bluff and accept his resignation, right? So I think Hooker for sure expected Halleck to say no, and that's why he was very specific in his letters saying, go directly to his boss, right? And we can work this out. By that time, I think Stanton and Lincoln had lost a lot of faith in Hooker. So one thing I do want to mention, folks, and you can see I manage our Facebook page and our website. I give programs all over Washington, D.C., free to the public. All the forts around Washington, D.C., the Civil War sites in Washington, D.C. as well. So just check out our calendar. I know D.C. is a little bit crazy, but come on down and enjoy some of the programming. We like to do them all over the city. And actually in May, I'm actually stealing Chris Gwynn. He's coming down to Gettysburg, and we're going to actually do a Grand Review program of the Grand Review in May of 1865. So when 140 to 50,000 troops marched up Pennsylvania Avenue from the Capitol building by the Treasury building and up to the White House, we're going to be doing that program. So we'll be walking in the footsteps of the Union Army in May of 1865. So there's a lot of stuff that we have coming out in 2020. So as I said, just look up our information. If not, just send me an email, and I'd love to hear from everyone. So thank you so much.
Folks, before you head out, I'll make one more promo. I hope you come back tomorrow, 1:30, for historian John Heiser, who will be doing a program that will focus on the neglected heroes of the Battle of Gettysburg, the Army Mule. So it'll be a unique one. I hope you're here. Thank you.
That was fun. Did you get a number here?
165.
I like it. 185. Cut it off 165. Oh, I see. Sir, how you doing?
Hello Hello, Getty's Nerds. It's Matt, and I hope you enjoyed that preview of our premium content that can now be found over at patreon.com. I just want to let you know that Addressing Gettysburg will always have free content for you to listen to in the forms of our narrative episodes like Antietam to Chancellorsville and the upcoming episode entitled Invasion, June 1863, appendix episodes, and our wildly popular Ask a Gettysburg Guide episodes. But episodes like Antietam to Chancellorsville take months to produce, as things are now. I hear from people almost every day asking how long until the next episode is finished. And the answer is, when I have the time, I can do it. Your support at Patreon can cut down the time it takes to produce an episode by months. Maybe you don't care about that. Maybe the Ask a Gettysburg Guide episodes are what you like, but they leave you wanting to learn more. Well, fear not. More is what Patreon is all about. Patrons receive access to new premium episodes each week. These episodes are straight interviews or discussions with licensed battlefield guides, rangers, local historians, academics, authors, public historians, people from the Gettysburg community who do impressive things, and frankly, just about anyone who can talk on a subject related to Gettysburg. I want to make sure that the interest you already have in Gettysburg is enriched with our premium content. Your support means the world to me, because that means it will be easier to produce content that will bring Gettysburg to more people and, hopefully, more people to Gettysburg. And the podcast episodes are just the beginning. So please go to patreon.com/addressinggettysburg. That's patreon.com/addressinggettysburg and become a patron. I thank you in advance.